Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alexander Kay. I am the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's seminar. Just a quick note about how things are going to work today. We're going to hear shortly from our presenter, Dr. Jonathan Ghariani, who I will introduce in just a moment. And during the talk, please feel free to offer any questions you have for our speaker in the chat on your own computers. And after the talk, after the formal presentation, I'm going to hand over to my colleague here at Brandeis, Dr. Shana Weiss, who will field the questions from the room in Brandeis and also from all of you watching online. There's also a closed caption sort of live transcript that you should be seeing, and you can turn that off on your own computers if you feel the need to do so. Let me now introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jonathan Ghariani. Dr. Ghariani has been a visiting scholar at the Schusterman Center this year and has brought a tremendous amount to the center over the past several months. He recently completed his doctorate at UCL, University College London, in the Hebrew and Jewish Studies department there, where he wrote a thesis about the diplomatic history of the Arab-Israeli final status negotiations. He's also been a visiting scholar at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies at Concordia University with Dr. Csaba Nikolenyi. He holds a master's degree in security and diplomacy from Tel Aviv and a bachelor's degree in government diplomacy and strategy from IDC in Herzliya. He's completed internships at the Institute for National Security Studies and at the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. And he has a tremendous breadth of expertise writing on Arab-Israeli negotiations, more recently on Israel's relations with Morocco and Oman, and actually he presented on that subject in Marrakesh just a few weeks ago, a very, very well-received talk that he gave there. Today, he's going to be talking about another aspect of his scholarly work, and the title of his talk will be A Diplomatic History of Turkish-Israeli Relations from 1996 to 2022. And I'll now hand over to Dr. Ghariani for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Kay, for this very kind introduction. But before we begin our presentation, I would like to have a thought for Professor Yuval Evry and express my deepest condolences and sympathy to Professor Evry and his family about this tragic loss. But without any further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. So in order to understand Turkey, the importance, the depth of Turkey-Israel relations, we need to go back to 1949, given the fact that Turkey was the first Muslim majority state to formally recognize Israel diplomatically. And subsequently, Turkey and Israel formally established diplomatic relations on January 7, 1950. Initially, relations between Turkey and Israel were cool, given the fact that Turkey was a member of the Baghdad Pact and was attempting to bring other Arab states into the Baghdad Pact. Now, for those who don't know, the Baghdad Pact was an alliance along the lines of NATO in the Middle East, and it included Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq until 1958, and the UK to counter Soviet influence in the region. And as such, Turkey was not had to take into account the Arab states' policy vis-a-vis Israel. But in 1958, relations started to improve, given the fact that there were converging interests between Turkey and Israel. Turkey and Israel had a common adversary at the time. It was Syria. Syria had been at war, in a state of war with Israel since 1948. And there were a territorial dispute between Turkey and Syria since 1939, as the French authorities transferred part of the Syrian-French mandate to the Republic of Turkey. This region is called the State of Alexandria or Hatay province. And until 2004, Syria claimed this territory as part of its own sovereign territory. And in that context, given the fact that there were also Soviet entrenchment in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt and Syria, Nikita Khrushchev, unlike Joseph Stalin, started a rapprochement with key Arab states such as Egypt and Syria and Iraq since 1958 with the pan-Arabist movements, pan-Arabist regimes. And in that context, David Ben-Gurion thought that there were an opportunity to establish relations with non-Arab Muslim states who also were at odds with either Nasser's Egypt or Syria, and that were Iran and Turkey, but also the Kurds in northern Iraq. And David Ben-Gurion actually made a secret visit to Ankara in September 1958, where he met with the Turkish Prime Minister at the time, Adnan Menderes, and the two leaders signed what would be known as the Periphery Pact. We don't know the exact details of that pact, but it mainly entailed, according to many sources, intelligence cooperation and other forms of security agreements. The pact was, as I've stated, tacit. It was not known to the public. It was actually classified even until today. And it will not actually last long, given the fact that I think 2 years later, Prime Minister Menderes was deposed, and the Arab states started to put pressure on Turkey to sever relations with Israel. So relations started to cool down between Turkey and Israel. And in 1980, it will actually culminate in Ankara withdrawing its ambassador from Tel Aviv in protest of the Knesset law on the unification of Jerusalem. The Knesset proclaimed Jerusalem as the united capital and eternal capital of Israel, and Turkey responded by downgrading relations with Israel. And it's actually, I think, the most important part of this presentation, relations will significantly improve in the 1990s. And this is due to the fact that in the aftermath of the Gulf War, Turkey calculated that the Arab states would no longer object an improvement of ties between Turkey and Israel, given the fact that the PLO and Yasser Arafat have supported Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War, and therefore would not object to a rapprochement between Ankara and Jerusalem. And also you had the Madrid Peace Conference, which was actually convened by the US President George H.W. Bush. And in the aftermath of the Madrid Peace Conference, where Turkey played an active part in multilateral talks, especially on arms control, which, I mean, Turkey played an important part in the working groups on arms control. Turkey decided it was time to restore full diplomatic relations with Israel and send back its ambassador to Tel Aviv. But at the same time, in order to balance its relations with the Palestinians, it also upgraded PLO representation from to ambassadorial level as well. Now, the Oslo Accords and the Israeli-Jordanian Peace Treaty would actually provide a significant boost to the Turkish-Israeli relations. And by 1994, I would say this is where this strategic rapprochement took place. Already in March 31st, 1994, Turkey and Israel signed a covert military agreement. We don't know the details of that agreement. And President Ezer Weizmann made an official visit to Ankara, where he met with his counterpart, President Süleyman Demirel. And Tansu Çiller was at the time the Prime Minister of Turkey, made a first official visit to Israel, the first official visit of a Turkish Prime Minister to Israel. Prime Minister Çiller met with Yitzhak Rabin and signed a series of defense cooperation agreements, but also on other issues such as economics and tourism. But at the same time, Prime Minister Çiller met with Faisal Husseini, a PLO official at the Orient House in East Jerusalem. It was a PLO headquarters in East Jerusalem. And also Israel was a bit displeased by the meeting, given the fact that Israel considered Jerusalem as its united capital and did not want any foreign officials to meet with PLO official in East Jerusalem. It nevertheless decided to downplay the event, and in fact, given the fact that Israel was keen on maintaining that emerging partnership with Turkey. And additionally, at that time in 1994, the US Congress signaled that there could be an arms embargo against Turkey over the issue of Northern Cyprus. And as such, the military was putting forward, was actually very much advocating the idea of a major strategic rapprochement with Israel. And in fact, by 2 years later, in February 1996, finally the two countries will establish strategic partnership, which will be known as the Military Training and Cooperation Agreement. And here you can see a picture of one of the agreements that resulted from this MTCA Memorandum of Understanding. It's the Reliant Mermaid Naval Exercise between the Turkish, Israeli, and US Navy, which were conducted annually until the event of the Mavi Marmara, which we'll discuss it later. Here you can see actually a picture of the F-4 Phantom of the Turkish Air Force, which was upgraded by Israel Aircraft Industries. I will talk about it in greater details afterwards. So this actually Memorandum of Understanding on Military Training and Cooperation was the most comprehensive military agreement ever signed in the Middle East. It entailed that that there will be cooperation, broad level of cooperation between all the branches of the Turkish armed forces, which also included 8 mutual visits by the Israeli and Turkish Air Force. It also entailed that there would be strategic dialogue, mutual visits, intelligence cooperation, and the transfer of military know-how. And subsequently, in the aftermath of that military training and cooperation agreement, a series of defense agreements were signed. For instance, Israel won the tender to upgrade F-4 and F-5 fighter jets of the Turkish Air Force. These were aging fighter jets, and Turkey in the past have also approached European countries such as Germany to upgrade its fleet of fighter jets, but they were turned down. Their requests were turned down again, given the issue of Northern Cyprus. The agreement also entailed the sale of advanced weaponry and co-production of stand-off missiles, joint military maneuvers. For instance, we mentioned the Reliant Mermaid Naval Exercise, which was actually a search and rescue drill by the Turkish, Israeli, and US Navy, conducted annually. The Israeli Air Force was also invited to participate in the Anatolian Eagle Air Force exercise, hosted by the Turkish Air Force, and with many NATO air forces in attendance. There were also intelligence sharing, intelligence cooperation, research and development. But the most important point, in my opinion, was the use of Turkish airspace for training purposes. But according to some sources, it was actually denied by the Turkish side, but according to some sources, the Israeli Air Force had access to Turkish airspace for operational purposes in case of, let's say, military operation against Iran nuclear facilities, against Iranian nuclear facilities. So that would have been a game changer and would provide Israel with a qualitative military aid. But we don't know actually at this stage if these actually reports were founded. Also, it is important to mention that the partnership was not a formal alliance. It was a partnership, a strategic partnership, meaning that, for instance, the defense treaty is considered as an alliance, which means that the countries within this defense treaty, such as, for instance, NATO, are committed to the defense of the other states. In this case, it was not a written alliance, but a partnership. And the relations between Turkey and Israel was not only limited to the military arena, and in fact, it also included a free trade agreement, which was signed by President Demirel in his first official visit to Israel on March 1996. And actually, the free trade agreement resulted in the lifting of all barriers and on trade and investment, and trade volume rose from $54 million in '87 to $1 billion in 1999. Today, Turkish export to Israel is around $7 billion, and Israeli export to Turkey is around $2 billion. There were, of course, cooperation on other issues such as water, technology, and environment as well. Now, what was the response regarding this Turkish-Israeli rapprochement? And the regional response was extremely negative. both Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia have denounced the Entente. Egypt, Osama al-Baz, a senior advisor to President Hosni Mubarak, stated that the Entente, the Israeli-Turkish rapprochement, was a threat to the Arab states' national security, and asked Turkey to reconsider it. And Syria also condemned the partnership. Abdallah Khadam stated that this is actually the biggest threat since 1948, and actually the Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia convened a summit in Damascus in 1997 to denounce the Entente. Greece and Cyprus too condemned the partnership, and there were rumors that Greece and Syria reached a military cooperation agreement where where Greece could use Syrian airfields in case of a war with Turkey. But there were actually some other actors actually who welcomed the agreement. There were actually one exception in the Arab world, and that is Jordan. Jordan welcomed the agreement and even would take part in it by sending military personnel to monitor the joint maneuvers between Turkey and Israel, the Reliant Mermaid naval exercise. And the reason as to why Jordan, in contrast to the Arab states, welcomed the agreement was due to the fact that Jordan, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty was categorized as a warm peace, as opposed to the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which was considered as a cold peace. Even though Egypt and Israel have been in a state of at peace since the signing of the peace treaty in 1979, the peace treaty was characterized as a cold peace. And in fact, Egypt saw Israel as a regional hegemon, given its military superiority in the region. And therefore, for instance, in every military exercise, Israel was designated as the enemy in every Egyptian military exercise. Now, I'm going to talk about how the Israeli public actually saw this rapprochement. And in fact, it was highly popular, especially among Likud supporters at the time. Initially, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres, Netanyahu's predecessor, were, although they actually welcome, and even Rabin is considered as an architect of that relationship, it nevertheless did not go too far. For instance, it did not formally label PKK as a terrorist group. Netanyahu actually publicly declared the PKK as a terrorist organization and rejected Kurdish independence aspiration. Now, at a time when the partnership was taking place, an Islamist-led government was in power. It was actually a coalition government of Erbakan, who was the leader of the Refah Islamist Party, and the True Path Party, a secular party of Tansu Çiller. Erbakan became prime minister, and Çiller became foreign minister. And even though Erbakan was known for his vocal critique of Israel, and even made anti-Semitic statements, he also denounced Turkey's position of foreign policy and stated that Turkey must withdraw from NATO and stop aligning with the West. Turkey's strategic cooperation with Israel will remain intact. And even though Erbakan tried to delay some of the agreements, for instance, he tried to delay the upgrades of F4 on the ground that it was too expensive, the military would put pressure on Erbakan, and he would actually acquiesce to every military agreement signed between Israel and Turkey. He would also try to delay to the last minute a meeting with an Israeli official. For instance, he delayed a meeting with David Levy in April 1997. But the military was very much in charge. And even though Erbakan started to make a rapprochement with Iran and with other key Islamic countries, actually Erbakan made his first official visit to a foreign country, to Iran, and he also toured later on Pakistan, Malaysia, and even Libya, who was at the time ostracized by the international community given its role in supporting terrorism and even operating terrorism. And as such, the Turkish military was not happy about the U-turn that Erbakan was taking, and in fact would put pressure on Erbakan to resign in June 1997. We talked about the Syrian factor in the past, that Syria actually was a common denominator that have enabled Turkey and Israel to establish partnership, initially a tacit partnership. And in this case, yes, it was again the case. It was actually the fact that Syria supported the PKK and even harbored Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK. Tensions actually were mounting between Turkey and Syria. In 1996, Prime Minister Yilmaz gave an ultimatum to Syria to either extradite or expel Abdullah Öcalan or face military actions by Turkey. And Turkey actually would even launch covert strikes against PKK targets in Syria, and Syria will respond by mobilizing 40,000 troops along its border with Turkey. And in October 1998, the two countries were again on the verge of war, Turkey giving an ultimatum to Syria to either extradite Öcalan or face potential war. Now, Israel was in a very difficult position. It actually provided military assistance to Turkey, such as intelligence on troops deployment from its latest satellite, the OFEC-4 satellite. It also provided weapon systems. But at the same time, Yitzhak Mordechai, who was then defense minister, signaled the Syrian regime that it has no intention to go to war with Syria should Turkey start and Syria go to war. And in fact, would signal Damascus of its intention by thinning out troops deployment on the Golan Heights. There were also an issue as well at the time. Israel in the late 90s, Israel was holding peace negotiations with Syria. Turkey was also very much unhappy about it, and even asked the United States to not to provide any military assistance to Syria should Israel and Syria reach a peace treaty, sign a peace treaty. Sorry. But eventually, relations between Turkey and Syria would improve, and the tensions would de-escalate. Actually, the two countries would normalize relations in exchange for Syria expelling Abdullah Öcalan. It was an agreement reached under Egyptian and Iranian mediation. And in 2000, in June 2000, President Ahmed Sezer attended Hafez al-Assad's funeral in Syria. But nevertheless, despite the thorough relations between Syria and Turkey, the partnership between Turkey and Israel remained intact and even blossomed around that time. Now you can see here a picture of Yitzhak Mordechai and the Turkish Chief of Staff, President Ezer Weizmann with his Turkish counterpart, President Süleyman Demirel. General Dan Khalutz was then commander of the Israeli Air Force, and his Turkish counterpart. And this is again a picture of the Reliant Mermaid exercise, trilateral exercise between the US and Turkish and Israeli Navy. And here it's actually a picture of the earthquake that took place in 1999. It's a tragic, dreadful earthquake that resulted in the death of 70,000 Turks. And Israel provided large amount of humanitarian assistance, including the building of a village and field hospitals. Now I'm going to talk about the relations that took place that existed between Turkey and Israel when Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power, who was elected in November 2002. Here you can see a picture of Erdogan and his counterpart Ariel Sharon. So even before Erdogan came to power on November 2002, relations between Turkey and Israel, at least on a political level, started to deteriorate, given the fact that the Second Intifada was taking place and violence were actually there were actually waves of violence and terror and terrorism. So when the IDF conducted an operation after the Passover massacre in March 28, 2002. Turkey denounced the IDF Operation Defensive. The Turkish Prime Minister Bülent denounced the IDF Operation Defensive Shield as a quote genocide. So it was even before the election of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But when Recep Tayyip Erdogan was elected in November 2002, Turkish foreign policy started to change a bit, and he started a rapprochement with key Arab and Islamic states such as Iran, but also Syria. Now, Erdogan would start to use harsh rhetoric for the first time in April 2004, in March 2004, when Ahmed Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, was killed by the ADF. He called it, and I quote, state terrorism. Israel condemned the remark, but again, did not want to go too far in its criticism as not to jeopardize the partnership between Turkey and Israel. And in fact, the military arena, the military partnership between Turkey and Israel remained intact, despite the political division on this issue. At the time, also Turkey and Syria were adopting rapprochement or détente, and Bashar al-Assad made a visit to Turkey in January 2004, and Syria formally renounced its claim to the Hatay and state of Alexandria province. Additionally, Assad requested that Turkey mediate talks between his country and Israel, and these requests were turned down by the United States and Israel. At the time, the Bush administration tried to isolate Syria for its support of terrorism, but also of Iraqi insurgents in Iraq. And Ariel Sharon had no intentions to make any concessions on the Golan Heights at all. Relations between Turkey and Israel after a frosty start will eventually improve, especially after the death of Yasser Arafat and the short-lived resumption of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the disengagement agreement. In 2005, also, Israel provided its most advanced UAV, the Iran UAV, and also agreed to upgrade Turkish M60 tanks. And also there were talks that Israel would provide its latest ABM system, the Arrow 3 system, to Turkey, and even production of the Merkava Mark III tank. On the political level, the relations started to improve as well, and Prime Minister Erdogan made an official visit to Israel in May 2005, where he also met with Ariel Sharon. Also, on November 13, 2007, the late President Shimon Peres addressed the Turkish parliament together with Mahmoud Abbas. But despite the improvement of relations between Turkey and Israel, there were some minor diplomatic crises between the two, especially with regards to Turkey's establishing ties with Hamas. And Khaled Meshaal would even make an official visit to Ankara in January 2006, shortly after Hamas won the election. So here you can see a picture of Shimon Peres addressing the Turkish parliament. With regards to the Syrian request for mediation, initially it was turned down by Prime Minister Sharon, but his successor, Ehud Olmert, actually was keener to negotiate a peace treaty with Syria, and in fact would acquiesce in February 2007 to Turkish mediation request, and would publicly even acknowledge the existence of indirect talks under Turkish mediation in October 2007. In May 2008, both Syria and Israel officially acknowledged the existence of these talks. And there were actually progress, both actually countries made progress on the contour of a peace treaty. And again, it showed that Syria was one of the main drivers that enabled the rapprochement between Ankara and Jerusalem. Now, in December 2008, relations between Turkey and Israel would start to deteriorate very rapidly after Operation Cast-Lead was launched. And this time, actually, all aspects of the relations between Turkey and Israel will be affected, including the military relations. Turkey also suspended its facilitating talks between Syria and Israel, and 361 Turkish MPs resigned from the Turkey-Israeli Friendship Group. And again, Erdogan used very harsh rhetorics, calling the operation a crime against humanity. Now, the reason as to why Erdogan was so angry about it is due to the fact that he wasn't warned about the operations, what he said. And also, he was negotiating between Assad and Olmert, and Assad was in the room when he was speaking to Olmert over the phone when the operation started. Now, in January 2007, the Davos summit took place, and Erdogan and Shimon Peres were of attendance. And Erdogan publicly lambasted Shimon Peres and stated, and I quote, "When it comes to killing, you know, killing very well. You know how to eat. I know how you eat and kill children on the beaches." So this was actually very, very harsh, brutal rhetorics, and he stormed out of the of the conference, which actually demonstrate that this time the relationship was damaged beyond repair. As I've mentioned before, the military arena, the military cooperation was affected, and Turkey canceled the Israeli Air Force participation in the Anatolian Eagle exercise. And in response, NATO forces also canceled their participation in solidarity with Israel. Turkey and Syria also conducted joint maneuvers on October 2009, given the fact, showing that the rapprochement between Syria and Turkey would now take a strategic level. And again, a diplomatic crisis took place on January 10, 2010, when after an anti-Semitic soap opera was broadcasted by a Turkish TV channel, Dani Ayalan, the then deputy foreign minister, summoned the Turkish ambassador to Israel and put him on a lower chair without a Turkish flag, which was seen as a humiliation by Turkey. And in response, Turkey recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv. Now, but the watershed moment that would undoubtedly lead to the collapse of the relations between Turkey and Israel was the Mavi Marmara incident, where a fleet of humanitarian, under the cover of a humanitarian mission, a fleet of 6 ships, organized by the IHH, the Humanitarian Relief Foundation, and the Free Gaza Movement, which had linked with the AKP and Hamas, attempted to break the Gaza blockade and was boarded by Israeli naval commandos in international waters. But in one incident, the IHH militants resisted violently, and resulting in the IDF retaliating by opening fire, leading to the death of 9 Turkish activists. Turkey denounced the incident and stated that Israel is a terrorist state and called the operation an act of piracy. And Israel strongly rejected Turkey's accusation and stated that if actually the motives of the IHH were humanitarian, then they should have actually loaded the ships in the port of Ashdod, where they would have been actually inspected and then transferred to the Gaza Strip. Now, the international community denounced the act. The United Nations Security Council condemned the operation, and a commission of inquiry set up by Geoffrey Palmer, the former New Zealand Prime Minister, was set up. And the Palmer report found that Israel's blockade under international law is legal, and that there were indeed dubious IHH claims, given the fact that they had the possibility to board all the humanitarian goods in the port of Ashdod. And they also deplored the report also deplored the conduct of the IDF operation and the overusage of force, the unproportional use of force. Turkey denounced the report as biased in favor of Israel and demanded 3 prerequisites before normalization could take place again between Turkey and Israel, and that is a formal apology, a compensation to the families who lost of those who lost their lives, and the lifting of the Gaza blockade. Israel rejected initially Turkey's demands, and at the same time there were also rapprochement between Turkey and Hamas as relations deteriorated between Turkey and Israel. Even though the ties between Hamas and the AKP dated back from much earlier, but by this stage, Hamas established a formal presence in Ankara and even conducted some terrorist operations from Turkish territory. The United States actually attempted to mediate talks between Turkey and Israel. They were very much alarmed by the situation, and on March 2013, when President Obama made an official visit to Israel, he asked Netanyahu to formally apologize. And when he was actually on the phone with Prime Minister Erdogan, Prime Minister Netanyahu formally apologized, and Erdogan accepted Israel's apology, leading to a process of reconciliation. Erdogan started to soften his rhetorics and spoke about the need for a strong Israeli-Turkey partnership, given the instability of the region. President Reuven Rivlin also called Erdogan to express his condolences after an ISIS terrorist attack occurred in Turkey in March 2016. And in May 2016, Turkey lifted its veto on Israel establishing an office at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And finally, in July 2016, Turkey and Israel reached an agreement to normalize relations again. Israel agreed to pay $20 million to the families of the activists killed in the incidents. The Turkish ambassador was to return to Israel, and they were talking about cooperating on natural gas projects. But the pre-2010 military cooperation would not be restored in the short term. And that is due, I think, to the fact that at this stage, Israel have established formal partnership with Greece and Cyprus. And this partnership involved not only the military arena, but also cooperation in natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey pledged also not to allow Hamas to conduct terror operation from its territories, and all lawsuits, criminal lawsuits against the Israeli chief of staff at that time, Gabi Ashkenazi, the naval commander, Eliezer Meron, and Israel defense minister Ehud Barak were all dropped. In Israel, actually, the response was mixed. In the center-left camp, it's like Herzog and Tzipi Livni of the Zionist Union, which was actually an alliance between Labour Party and Atnoa movement of Tzipi Livni, welcomed the agreement. But at the same time, the right-wing camp, led by Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, rejected the agreement. And Netanyahu called the agreement actually realpolitik. In the international arena, President Obama and UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon, as well as EU leaders, welcomed the agreement. But unfortunately, the partnership, or the normalization was short-lived, as in 2018, after the Gaza fence incident, Turkey recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv. And again, Erdogan used very harsh rhetorics against Israel, called the attacks again, the incidents as a genocide, and Netanyahu would respond in kind by saying that Erdogan committed war crimes against the Kurds. So again, the relations were again deteriorating very rapidly. The Israeli ambassador was also recalled, but was expelled from Turkey, and in fact subjected to similar humiliations. For instance, he had to actually go through security checking at the airport, and this, of course, was go against international protocol. But the reason as to why relations started to break down between Turkey and Israel is due to the, I would say, the ideological proximity between AKP and Hamas, as well as other Muslim Brotherhood regimes, such as Morsi, when Morsi was elected president of Egypt in 2012, as well as the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and of course the waning influence of the Turkish military since 2001. And the Palestinian issue also became one of the components of Turkish foreign policy, leading to, I think, the deterioration of ties between Israel and Turkey. Now, recently, relations significantly improved, especially after Naftali Bennett and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and President Herzog called President Erdogan to thank him for his role in the releasing of the two Israeli tourists who were accused on false charges of espionage. And in December 2021, again, Erdogan's meeting with Jewish leaders spoke about the need for a strong Turkey-Israeli partnership, which is vital for the stability of the region. And Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu called his counterpart Yair Lapid when the latter was tested COVID-19 positive. Lapid made a visit to Turkey as well in I think March 2022 to thank Erdogan and Çavuşoğlu about Turkish intelligence effort to thwart IRGC attempt to harm Israeli citizens or kidnap Israeli citizens in Turkey. So the big question is whether there's going to be a rapprochement between Turkey and this rapprochement between Turkey and Israel will lead to the restoration of the partnership that have existed in the 1990s, and I would say not in the immediate future, given the fact that Israel needs to take into account its relations with Greece and Cyprus, and it will be actually a step-by-step approach. But the fact that Benny Gantz, the defense minister, met with Erdogan, and that Israel provided a large amount of humanitarian assistance during this dreadful earthquake. And I would like to have a thought for all those who perished in this earthquake. I think it's important to express our sympathy to the families of the victims who perished in this dreadful accident, in this dreadful disaster. So Israel actually provided assistance, and Turkey was very much pleased by this. And it showed actually that they demonstrated that perhaps partnership, a formal partnership, could be restored at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Shana Weiss. I am the Associate Director here of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. We are going to have now time for question and answer and discussion. Please continue to put your questions in the Q&A or any comments in the chat, and I'll try to get as many as possible. We always start with questions in the room. So I would like to see if anyone in the room has questions to ask Dr. Sarna, Professor Sarna.
First of all, thank you for this comprehensive talk, and it's wonderful to see how chronology actually explains a lot and is crucial. I wonder, though, whether you think the presence initially of a large Jewish community in Turkey. Now that community is much smaller, but what role did the presence of a large Jewish community in Turkey have on this relationship, and to what extent did the interests of the Jewish community impinge or shape in some ways the relationship, and to what extent, as that community got smaller and smaller, did that again have an impact? Or
I'm not sure if it had an impact. I think the relations between Israel and Turkey was very much tied to realpolitik, as we mentioned, and tied to the fact that there were common interests and common threats. But Erdogan, for instance, recently spoke with the Jewish community in Ankara. So it showed that the Turkish community, I think, might have actually some role in Erdogan's desire for rapprochement with Israel. But I think it's mainly connected to other events, mainly geopolitical events at this point.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a small question. The only knowledge I have about Turkey is the vacation package.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, when I hear like the positive and negative, and again positive and negative with Turkey, how would this movement affect our package?
Well, I think it has, because after the events of the Mavi Marmara incident, tourism actually took a hit. I mean, it was at its lowest point. But eventually, when the rapprochement took place, now many people are now visiting Turkey again. So yes, I think the relations between Turkey and Israel have an impact on tourism. Also, an important point to mention as well is trade. Trade was not impacted even during the worst days of the relations. The trade volume between Turkey and Israel remained intact and even increased after the Mavi Marmara incident.
Just to explain Dr. Molla's comment, for those of you who don't know, for a lot of Israelis, Turkey is a relatively cheap vacation place. You can always get cheap tickets to go for the weekend, to go to the beaches for a couple of days, beautiful resort towns, and there's a huge amount of tourism between Israel and Turkey in that respect. Okay, are there any other questions in the room? Oh yeah, sorry. Here, Skylar, and then we'll take your.
Sure. Thank you for this presentation. Very comprehensive. You mentioned at a couple of points the sort of swing within sort of public opinion of Israelis towards Turkey. I was wondering if you have any read on the current situation. obviously the government right now is pretty far-right coalition, and I had heard some news stories about various things that were said following the earthquake recently. I'm curious what your outlook is on that.
My research mainly focuses during the 1990s, but I think that the Israeli public opinion started to turn much more in favor of Turkey, especially after the earthquake. I mean, it's definitely the Israeli public have showed a lot of sympathy to what happened after this tragedy. So I would imagine that as relations improve between Turkey and Israel, the Israeli public opinion will change significantly.
Yes.
I'm probably going to butcher this, but sorry, I'm probably going to butcher this, but the new candidate for the opposition, Kılıçdaroğlu, how, if the regime changes and a new president is elected in Turkey, how would that affect the relationship between?
Can you repeat the question?
No, it's okay. I think the relations between Turkey and Israel will continue to improve regardless of who will come to power, even if it's Erdogan at this point, given the fact that he's not in a position to really challenge Israel, and he wants to have better relations with everyone. Now, Turkish foreign policy have been unstable. For instance, Erdogan initially wanted to establish good relations with everybody. His foreign minister, Ahmet Davutoglu, at that time had a policy of zero problems with neighbors. In fact, he had a lot of problems with many neighbors, such as with after Morsi actually was deposed in 2013 by the Egyptian military after the Egyptian demonstrations. Turkey almost severed relations. I mean, not severed relations, but the relations degraded significantly between Egypt and Turkey, also between the UAE and Turkey. So it's very hard to predict what would happen, but I would imagine that the relations between Turkey and Israel will continue because it's realpolitik and there are common interests between the two countries.
And does the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi in the past couple of weeks change the situation?
No, I don't think so. Because Turkey anyway had very good relations with Iran, regardless of its relations with Israel. And by the way, there were a picture of an Iranian C-130 Hercules together with an Israeli jet in Turkey. So both countries actually have established good relations with Turkey, and I don't think it will have major impact on Israeli-Turkey relations.
Thank you. That was actually one of my questions, so I'm glad that you asked it. There are a ton of questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to start to turn to those, but please continue to send them in and I will try to get to as many as possible. We had a question about the relationship between Turkey and Israel and if it's been affected since the war, since Russia invaded Ukraine about a year ago. Has that had any effects or realignments? No.
With regards to Israel, the relations, I mean, the conflict in Ukraine doesn't impact the Turkey-Israel relations.
Okay. Okay. So there's also a lot of questions that have come up about sort of Turkey's own, I'd say to put it somewhat gently, non-democratic policies and some of critiques of human rights abuses, whether against the Kurds or also the Armenian genocide. And I was wondering, and this is actually combining a couple of questions, if you could comment on the role that has played or not with Israel's relations with Turkey and how, especially as Erdogan gets sort of more and more criticized.
Yeah, with regards to the Armenian genocide, I think Yossi Sarid, who was the education minister during Barak government in 1999, I could be wrong, but I think he actually acknowledged publicly the Armenian genocide, and as a result, Turkey was very much displeased about Yossi Sarid stance on this. So yes, it can have. I don't think it have a made. I mean, the Kurds definitely have an impact. As I mentioned before, Netanyahu stated that Erdogan commits war crimes against the Kurds during the tensions between Turkey and Israel. So I would assume yes, and also Israel, I think, established relations with the KRG in northern Iran, in northern Iraq, the Kurds in northern Iraq. It has actually strong ties with KRG. So yeah, I think it played not a significant role, but I think it definitely influenced the relations between Turkey and Israel.
Yeah, there was another question. I'm scrolling through to make sure. about early history that I thought was interesting. You mentioned that the Prime Minister Menderes had a sort of met in secret with Ben Gurion, maybe not pro-Zionist, but pro-Israel to some extent. And the question is, how do you square that with a coup that he organized in the Jewish community in Istanbul? And this is a historical event I don't know about, so I apologize. And the destruction of the Pera neighborhood, which was a Jewish neighborhood in Istanbul. So how do you, is that just realpolitik, right? Or how do you think about that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Because
you talked about Menderes, this is going early back, right? Early on, his pro-Israel, or at least interest in relationship with David Ben Gurion. And yet, this person asked a question about his damaging behavior regarding the Jewish community in Istanbul.
Well, the thing is, I'm not very familiar with this, with Menderes' relations with the Jewish community, but the reason as to why the pact was established was due to the fact that Turkey was a NATO member as well, right? Since 1952, and again, it wanted to establish relations with pro-Western government. But I'm sorry, I can't really answer the question regarding Menderes' link to the Jewish community.
But I think what it raises is this contradiction, is it raises the point of, I think this speaks to Jonathan's question, how little perhaps the local Jewish community and what's going on matters in this. And maybe that's a disappointing thing to hear, but it's an interesting thing nevertheless. I wanted to ask you about something that you've alluded to, and that is intelligence in Turkey. I think both for Israel and for other Arab countries or other countries in the Middle East, Turkey is a place where a lot of intelligence operations happen. We see it in pop culture, right? We know targeted assassinations from different sides take place there. How do Turkey-Israel relations play a part of that? And how does intelligence sharing and operations complicate or ease that process along?
Well, I've mentioned the fact that the Turkish intelligence thwarted the IRGC attempt to arm or kidnap Israeli tourists in Turkey. So this is actually an example of cooperation. I think that they cooperated as well on Iran and against Iran and the proliferation of WMDs in the Middle East. At that time, Turkey and Israel were very much alarmed by Iran's acquisition. Iran testing theatrical ballistic missiles, and the fact that Syria also procured Scud-D ballistic missile as well. And the two countries cooperated against terrorism as well. So it's very hard to re-answer the question. I'm not a specialist of intelligence issues, but I would assume that it's played a significant role in the relations. I think even since the adoption of the periphery of the 1950s, the cooperation was very much linked to the intelligence issues, especially on Syria, especially on the key regional issues.
So there's been a couple of questions about sort of what's in it for Turkey and Israel. And my question is this simply a case of sort of enemy of your enemy is your friend, let's say with regard to Syria,
Yes.
or it's good economic sense, right? Everyone likes, business and tourism. I'm thinking of all the dried fruit. When you buy dried fruit in Israel, almost all of it comes from Turkey.
Yes.
Or do you think that there are sort of real strategic interests that have carried this relationship through?
I think the reason as to why Israel and Turkey established a relationship is mainly linked to the strategic arena. And the fact that Syria was the main concern for both countries, this actually was, I think, the main driving factor. Iran, I think, was also a factor as well, because both Turkey and Israel saw the Iranian nefarious influence on the regional security as well. So I think the main aspect that have led to the military relationship was undoubtedly the military arena, but at the same time, even after the Mavi Marmara incident and the collapse of the strategic partnership, there were still the trade volume between Turkey and Israel increased. So I wouldn't actually say that the military, the strategic aspect of the relationship is the only factor. There are other factors as well, and I'm quite confident that tourism and the economy was a major factor here.
you mentioned the earthquake, and there were reports that the earthquake about a month or so ago that the Israeli rescue teams were sent home early. It's not, can you comment more on that? There was talk about security concerns. It's not entirely clear what happened. I'm wondering if you had any comment on that.
Well, I think that the main issue was due to security reason. They feel that the rescue team might have been targeted by perhaps IRGC or other terrorist organizations, so they decided to leave earlier because of security concerns, I think.
I wanted to ask, sorry, and I want to say, first of all, does anyone in the room have any other questions? I've been okay. I wanted to ask about the directions of these relations. We talked a lot about how Israelis vacation a lot in Turkey. A lot of them know about Turkish culture or Turkish food. It's part of, there are a lot of Turkish Jews in Israel. Obviously, Turkey is a much bigger place, a lot more people in Turkey. But do Turkish people know about Israel? Do they visit Israel? Do they watch Israeli television, right? What is that cultural exchange going on?
I think they do actually watch Israeli television and Israeli television programs and soap operas. And they actually also, I think some Turks also visited, some Turkish citizens visit Israel as well. Not as many, it's not equal. Like, I think there are more Israeli tourists visiting Turkey, but I would assume that Turkish citizens also visit Israel as well.
And I know just from some cultural groups, for example, I know sometimes Turkey is a place where Israeli musicians can interact with others from the larger Muslim world. So maybe sometimes Turks, but also just other people. Like, I remember I saw AWA, sort of really interesting Mizrahi group. They performed in Turkey, and all these Arabic-speaking fans flew into Turkey to meet them. So it's this interesting sort of in-between place for them to, for people to meet. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank everyone for participating. And of course, Jonathan, for your really amazing talk and for being with us this year as a visiting scholar. And to all of you tuning in, I want to mention some of our events coming up. A big one, and this is a new event, spurred by current events. We will have a panel discussion next week on March 22nd with Menachem Ben Sasson and many Brandeis experts on the judicial reforms in Israel. Information for that is how to sign up for that is on our website. And on the next day, on the 23rd, we will have the latest installment of our Sephardic Modernity series with a talk on Judeo-Spanish proverbs and the role that they play with us today. So thank you all again. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to our tech team, and to thank you everyone who tuned in. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.